If you study military history long enough, you realize something important very quickly. Armies don't fail from lack of weapons as often as they fail from cold, damp, and exhaustion. During the Second World War, millions of soldiers lived for months or years in hastily built barracks across Europe, the Soviet Union, Asia, and North America. Central heating was rare, fuel was rationed, and winter was relentless. Yet entire divisions survived brutal cold seasons using practical insulation methods that modern people have largely forgotten. Before we go any further, if this kind of grounded historical knowledge matters to you, subscribe to Warfield Prepper Chronicles, like the video, and leave a comment with your thoughts or field experience. Now, let's get straight into it. How WWII barracks were insulated using layered construction and dead air space. Most WWII barracks were built fast, cheap, and with materials at hand, but they relied heavily on one principle modern insulation still depends on: trapped air. Walls were rarely single-layer boards. They were typically double-planked, with a gap between the inner and outer boards. That space was often filled loosely with sawdust, wood shavings, straw, cork fragments, or even crumpled paper. The goal was not airtight perfection, but reducing convection. Soldiers noticed immediately that barracks with packed wall cavities stayed warmer overnight, even with minimal stove use. This can be applied today by creating secondary interior walls or removable panels in cabins, garages or sheds. Filling cavities with loose natural material, even dried grass or cardboard, dramatically reduces heat loss when no modern insulation is available. How floor insulation mattered more than wall insulation in winter quarters. Cold rose through floors faster than it escaped through walls, especially when barracks were built directly on frozen ground. WWII engineers often raised floors on timber sleepers, leaving an air gap beneath the structure. That space was sometimes packed with straw, pine boughs, or earth. In Eastern Front barracks, soldiers added additional layers inside, laying wooden pallets, scrap planks, or even doors on top of existing floors, then covering them with blankets or tarps. For modern preparedness, this is, well, critical knowledge. Elevating sleeping areas, even just a few inches off concrete or earth, and placing insulating layers beneath reduces heat loss dramatically. A raised bed platform with cardboard, wool blankets or wood underneath is far more effective than simply adding blankets on top alone. How ceiling insulation trapped heat where soldiers needed it most. Heat rises, and, World War II barracks were often tall with uninsulated roofs, making them coal boxes by night. Field modifications were common. Soldiers would suspend fabric, tarps, or spare tent canvas below rafters to create a lower ceiling. This trapped warm air around bunks instead of letting it escape into unused overhead space. In some cases, pine branches were woven into rafters and covered with paper or cloth to slow airflow. This technique translates easily today. Hanging fabric ceilings in tents, sheds or garages creates a warmer microclimate with no additional fuel. Even something as simple as a low-hung sheet above a sleeping area can honestly raise perceived temperature significantly. Now, let's talk about how entrances and drafts were controlled, even though modern ceiling materials weren't available back then. Doors were, major points where heat would just escape. In World War II barracks, draft control was often pretty crude, but surprisingly effective. Soldiers would hang blankets or even their coats over doorways, creating these makeshift fabric airlocks. In some cases, units built small entry vestibules out of scrap lumber to prevent that biting wind from blowing straight in. And when glass was either shattered or simply not available, windows would be covered with oiled paper, waxed cloth, or just layers of fabric. So you can actually apply these same ideas today by creating layered door curtains and secondary entry barriers in any cold shelter you might find yourself in. Heavy fabric alone, especially when it's layered, blocks airflow much more effectively than a lot of people might expect. Now, let's look at how stoves were integrated with insulation, rather than just being relied on by themselves. Barracks heating depended on small wood or coal stoves, but it was really the insulation that made them work well. Stoves were often placed right in the centre, with bunks arranged around them to make the most of that radiant heat. Sometimes reflective metal sheets or even brick backings were installed behind the stoves to direct heat inward rather than letting it escape. And barracks without insulation, well, they just burned through a lot more fuel for far less warmth. The lesson here is simple and timeless. Insulation always comes before heating. Even a small heat source becomes effective once heat loss is controlled. In survival settings, insulating the space first can reduce fuel needs by more than half. How bedding systems acted as personal insulation when buildings failed. Even the best barracks were cold during extreme winters. Soldiers relied on layered bedding systems as the final line of defence. Straw-filled mattresses, wool blankets and canvas covers were standard. Beds were stacked or placed close together to share warmth. Empty spaces were avoided. Cold corners were blocked with stacked gear or crates. This knowledge applies directly today. Personal insulation matters as much as shelter insulation. Layered bedding, natural fibres, and blocking dead space around sleeping areas dramatically improve warmth without electricity. Moisture control was absolutely vital in preventing cold injuries and unnecessary heat loss. Moisture, you see, was the enemy. When insulation became damp, it lost its effectiveness remarkably quickly. In World War II barracks, there was a strong emphasis on ventilation during daylight hours to dry out the interiors, even if it was freezing outside. Wet bedding was aired out every day, whenever possible. And of course, straw and other organic insulation materials were replaced frequently to prevent rot and mould from setting in. Modern users should remember that insulation must stay dry to work. Ventilation during warmer daylight hours, even briefly, preserves warmth overnight. This balance between airflow and heat retention is honestly one of the most overlooked lessons from wartime living. WWII Barracks insulation was never about comfort. It was about endurance. Layered walls slowed heat loss, raised floors blocked ground cold, lowered ceilings trapped warmth, controlled drafts prevented wind chill, and bedding systems protected the individual. None of these methods required advanced technology, only understanding and discipline. For modern preppers, historians, and survivalists, these techniques remain relevant. They work in power outages, off-grid shelters, winter camps, and emergency housing. They were proven under the harshest conditions imaginable and refined by necessity. If you found this breakdown valuable, subscribe to Warfield Prepper Chronicles, like the video, and share it with someone who studies history or prepares seriously for winter conditions. Leave a comment with your own experience or questions. These lessons deserve to stay alive, because cold still defeats the unprepared.